Good. I don't know if I should call you Dr. Carlson or if you have a preferred.
No, you can call me Elof. That's fine. My students all call me Elof.
That's what's the origins of Elof?
It's a Swedish name. My father is from Stockholm,
Oh,
and he was Axel Elof Carlson. I'm Elof Axel Carlson.
your path has taken a similar arc to my grandfather, who also went. He went to the University of New York back in the late 30s and 40s. Followed that up with his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, but they all went out to Indiana as well. Um,
What field was your grandfather in?
he was a solid state physicist.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. Well, they had a very fine physics department at Indiana at the time Muller was here, and one of the persons in the physics department did the calculations in the Manhattan Project to prove that if an atomic bomb was ignited, the Earth wouldn't disappear.
I actually believe that my grandfather may have worked on the Manhattan Project. He used to take regular drives down to Oak Ridge, Tennessee
Oh, sure.
from Massachusetts back then.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Virtually every physicist was recruited for the Manhattan Project. It was an amazing, large-scale use of talent. I'm amazed that they were able to do this and get so many people to uproot themselves from where they were and work for all those years.
Yeah, probably one of the more interesting books that I read last year was The Plutonium Files by a Pulitzer Prize winning author named Eileen Wellsome. And it talked about the effects of the radioactive testing and the government's need to keep up to speed with the ongoing litigation, and how they created a Manhattan Project annex up at the University of Rochester and other locations such as Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But it's a great book if you're interested in history, which I know you are, especially surrounding the Manhattan Project. That's a great place to start out. But I want to tell you, I appreciate you taking my call today. I started doing some research on some family history, and the topic of eugenics kind of wove in and out of the discussion as part of the research, and it kind of caught my attention, and I was interested in shed some light. I've read some of your book and some of your research, and it's fascinating. So I guess if it's all right, I'll just start at the beginning of some of the questions here.
Yeah, sure.
How did you personally get interested in the study of eugenics?
When I was in high school, I got imprinted with becoming a geneticist when I took a high school biology course. And I had a teacher who had each student each day read a clipping that she took from a magazine or a newspaper. And the clipping that I had was on Muller getting his Nobel Prize. This is 1946. And when I read it, this was something I hadn't learned. I loved evolution because I always went to the Museum of Natural History. And I immediately saw, oh, here's a field where you connect evolution and genetics, and you can change heredity. How remarkable with X-rays. So I ended up working with Muller. I got imprinted like a duckling.
When you said that you could change genetics with X-rays, are you talking about mutating the actual on the cellular level, or what are you speaking of there?
You mutate either eggs or you mutate sperm, and when they reproduce, they transmit usually damaged DNA, but occasionally you get a lucky mutation and it'll be more beneficial. And, it just speeds up what nature does.
Right. So Mueller's work was focused predominantly on the
radiation genetics and the nature of the gene.
Gotcha.
Those were his twin interests.
Gotcha. So you ended up going and getting your degree then at
Indiana. I first went to NYU in 1949 and got my BA in 1953, and I knew about eugenics because another of my teachers, who was in mathematics, was if not a communist, he was certainly left-wing, and helped organize the teachers' union. And in 1948, there was a lot of publicity about repression of genetics in the USSR by the Lysenko movement that tried to destroy classical genetics, calling it a bourgeois, fascistic, elitist type of approach. And they believed in a Lamarckian view that they could transform heredity by retraining it after shattering it. That was Lysenko's gospel. And people knew, my teachers all knew that I wanted to be a geneticist. So Mr. Wallach, my math teacher, who was the one who was the left-winger, said, you know, Elof, not everybody who is liberal is hostile to genetics, and I'd like to give you a book. So he gave me Muller's Out of the Night. So that was my second contact with Muller while I was still in high school. So not only did he induce mutations in X-rays, but he was a proponent of positive eugenics. So I read that book Out of the Night while I was in high school.
Wow. I want to circle back around to that because I'm going to have a question about that. But before I get there, I'd like to kind of back up a little bit. And could you talk to me a little bit about the modern origins of eugenics in the United States, and maybe how it spread from Galton to people like James Mateen Cattell at Penn and Columbia?
Right. It actually is earlier than Galton because the first attempts to interpret human hereditary behavior occur after 1700. And in my book on the unfit, I show that in England, this interpretation was called degeneracy theory, that people were considered degenerate. What did they mean by it? Well, the Industrial Revolution is beginning in the 1700s. Industrialization is starting. Suddenly you have new problems that are appearing. You're having a lot of vagrancy, a lot of gambling, a lot of prostitution, a lot of tramps. You're having a lot of discontent. You're having a lot of illness and epidemics occurring in cities. And the people who are blamed for their social failure raised the question in the minds of their accusers, which was, why is it that some people pull themselves up by their bootstraps, have the gumption to work hard, started out poor and became very wealthy, and others start out poor, wallow in their poverty, don't do anything, and fail in life, become thieves, petty thieves, worse yet, criminals that end up in jail or get hanged. Well, what is the difference between these two poor people, that one goes the straight path and the other goes the failure path? Well, that led to this idea that bad environments, if you stay in them, don't escape from them, have a way of corrupting you and making you worse each generation. The French took it in a direction and said, it not only gets worse each generation, but it's self-extinguishing, and after 5 generations, that's the end of the line for those failures. And the English took a view that with the proper type of environment, you can shift people from a state of failure to a state of success. Now that idea caught on in the United States, and you've got all these reform movements, Dorothy and Dix and others, developing the asylum movement, better treatment of prisoners, better treatment of the retarded, better treatment of the psychotic, in the hopes that this will lead to positive change. And the person who made the most detailed study, the 1860s, late 1860s, was a guy named Richard Dugdale. And Dugdale in New York took the view that if you took this group of degenerates, a group that was called the Jukes, and you gave them a Head Start education by importing the German kindergarten school system, and instead of vocational training, you gave them full liberal arts education. You want to cultivate their sense of beauty, their aesthetics, literature, philosophy, and the like. And you want to give them decent housing, and you want to give them work where they can earn an income to support a family. If you give this, he said, in 3 generations there'll be no more Jews. Well, of course, most people are not going to put money up in taxes to help a bunch of failures. So when Dugdale died, people took his book on the Jukes and said, this is physiological evidence for the degeneracy of the Jukes kindred. And the only way to prevent the Jukes from spreading is to prevent them from reproducing. So there should be restrictive marriage laws. And then by the 1890s, there should be compulsory sterilization. So that's how it got shifted into eugenics. It would have happened if Galton had never coined the term.
Are you familiar, I'm sure, with James Mateen Cattell at Penn and Columbia?
Yes, he was a psychologist, and he was a strong supporter of the work that Lewis Terman did in Stanford University on genetic studies of genius, and believed that people of unusual talent and intelligence had a hereditary basis for it. And he was a supporter of positive eugenics, just as Miller was a supporter of positive eugenics, and just as Galton was a supporter of positive eugenics. But there was, as I said, before that view of positive eugenics was popularized by Galton in the 1880s and 1890s. Before that was this view of degenerate tribes of social failures intermarrying with healthy, normal people and pulling them down and corrupting the stock of the country. And that was a fear in England, it was a fear in France, it was a fear in Germany, a fear in the United States. It got much more publicity then, because most people in America say, this is democracy, and if Abe Lincoln can become president, anybody can become president. And he didn't need special gifts. The American credo was largely seen as ordinary people can become extraordinary if the country gives them opportunity. So there was no real feeling of just because you're smart doesn't mean that we owe anything to you.
You talked about there's kind of a marked difference between British eugenics and American eugenics. Can you tell me a little bit about what knowledge you might have on how the eugenics movement in Britain particularly may have kind of morphed or influenced the religious side of things, say with ideas like British Israelism?
I think the main difference is that Britain has always had a layered society. You have the nobility on top, then you have the aristocracy below it, then you have the nouveau riche below that, then you have the lower middle class clerics of all sorts below that, then you have the laboring class below that, and then you have the paupers and the social failures at the bottom of the pyramid. And that was the way England saw it. And that meant if you came from the elitist groups on top, you went to Eton, you went to Cambridge or Oxford, and if you were at the bottom, you were lucky to be a street sweeper or a porter.
Were there means of social elevation through classes that developed in the 20th century through military
in England,
means?
There were. It began changing in the 20th century, mainly because public education was universal, and there were scholarships available, and people with talent could be recognized and sent off to higher education. And in the United States, there was much more fluidity and less of a hereditary class of elites. When Tocqueville went around the United States, he was just stunned that there was nothing equivalent to the aristocracy in the United States. And that everybody thought they were just as good as anybody else. That was the American belief at that time. But as the Industrial Revolution in the United States kept increasing and social failures became more numerous, and the problem what to do with them, the costs of either putting them in asylums or putting them in prison, became a problem of raising taxes. Then people began to search for alternatives. What can we do to reduce the number of degenerates? So the Americans had no real interest in cultivating positive eugenics the way the British did. British, like Galton said, yes, you can rise to the top through genetics. If brighter people and more talented people had more children, and if those who were less able had fewer children, you will greatly increase this in a matter of a few generations. So Galton was Muller's inspiration for that, for positive eugenics.
So the positive eugenics side is the part that intrigues me. So both my grandfather, he came from a family of 2 children, as did my grandmother. My grandmother went to Hahnemann Medical School, I believe it was.
Right, in Philadelphia, yeah.
Yep, and at the same time my grandfather was going to the University of Pennsylvania. Both of them came from a mostly nuclear family, but they ended up going and having 8 children themselves.
Right, which was unusual.
Would you? It seems that both the University of Pennsylvania and Hahnemann both had courses that they were teaching in eugenics and had a eugenics background. Can you tell me a little bit about the curriculum that were in the colleges back then and how much eugenics movement influenced the curriculum?
It was not only present in the college curriculum, it was also present in elementary school, because when I was in 4th or 5th grade in Manhattan, I remembered the textbook showing the Kallikak family and using that as a way of talking about good families and bad families and the importance of being aware of who your future spouse will be. So there was an attempt, primarily by people like Cattell, by Davenport, who certainly supported that, by Harry Laughlin of the Eugenics Record Office, who certainly supported that this should be part of what children learn, particularly as they get older and can handle concepts of marriage and parenthood. And virtually every genetics text of that era, from roughly about 1915 to about 1950, had a chapter or two on eugenics.
See, that's the part that I haven't not lived through that era. I've seen. I live in Iowa right now, and I know Indiana was one of the first states to pass eugenics laws back in '07, I believe. And I know
right, and that was due to Harry Clay Sharp, a physician, but his reasons were not positive eugenics. They were. He was the physician for the Jeffersonville prison, which was near Louisville, Kentucky. And right across the river was the prison. And he was concerned and learned in medical school that degeneracy was caused by masturbation. And of course, he had young prisoners. It was a reform school. And he tried to give them pep talks about not masturbating. They would come up to him and say, "I can't help it, Doc. I can't stop. Is there anything you can do?" And then he came up with the idea of doing vasectomies. Why he thought this would be effective as a cure for masturbation, I don't know. But certainly he believed it and tried it out on his prisoners and claimed that they stopped masturbating and felt better and gained weight. And he used that as propaganda in his letters to the governor to get the state of Indiana to pass a law. And eventually he got that by 1909.
So in I believe it was the first eugenics conferences were in 1907 or 1912 was the second one?
Well, I thought it was 1909 for Indiana, but maybe his propaganda began in 1899, because that was when he did his first vasectomy. And by the time it got passed into law, he had already done several hundred vasectomies.
So
he claimed with the permission of the prisoners. That's maybe dubious.
Right. I don't think they had the consent forms on file. Right.
No.
They began having a records office not too far from where your split level was, I guess.
Right, at Cold Spring Harbor.
Can you tell me a little bit about the committees, their composition, and what type of records they kept, how long they kept them for, and what they were looking for, and all that?
Yeah, the idea of an academic center for eugenics was proposed by David Starr Jordan and Alexander Graham Bell at a meeting of the American Breeders Association, and they said there should be a third group in addition to animal and plant genetics. There should be a third group of human genetics, but that term wasn't in use in those days. It was called eugenics. So eugenics became the third wing of the American Breeders Association. They set up a committee and asked Davenport, who was a very respected scientist at the time with a strong interest in genetics.
He was from Iowa, wasn't he?
He was raised in Brooklyn, actually, and on a farm in Connecticut that his father had, but he was raised in New York.
Oh, I was thinking of who was the gentleman who was the first chair of one of the eugenics committees who had gone to school in Iowa State and Drake and Oskaloosa?
Oh, that's Laughlin.
Laughlin, there we go.
Yeah, Harry Laughlin.
Okay.
Right. So Davenport was selected to design a building and set up academic criteria for what turned out to be three different activities. The first activity was a summer station to educate high school teachers about both eugenics and the new field of genetics. And they used the summer training originally at Brooklyn Institute, and then when they got the land with Carnegie money and set up the Cold Spring Harbor campus, they purchased a building and called it the Eugenics Record Office. It was the second building that Davenport also designed based on the Naples Marine Biology Station. He virtually copied the architecture. He had a background in engineering. And he got that building set up. And then the third was the building for eugenics. So you have a building for the Summer Institute, a building for genetics, basic genetics, and a building for the Eugenics Record Office. And Davenport was the top dog in charge of the whole complex, but obviously he had to have other people help him. So he recruited a student of his, Harry Laughlin, a guy from Iowa, who he asked to be superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office, which he was very happy to do. And then he felt after a few years that Laughlin would have more clout if he had a PhD. So he called up a friend of his at Princeton, a guy named George Harrison Shaw, and he said, can you take him on as a student? I'd like to see him with a little more clout with a PhD. So that's how Harry Laughlin got his doctorate.
Can you tell me what they were hoping to do with the information that was collected in the Eugenics Records Office?
Right. They got a committee together of people in psychology, criminology, people in public health, geneticists as an advisory board. And they designed a questionnaire for family history. It was something like 4 pages or so. And in it, they got the basic information on parents, grandparents, and where available, great-grandparents. And if these were people who had children or grandchildren, they could list that. Then they would give occupations. Then there were a whole bunch of questions on each family member on physical illnesses, mental illnesses, if they were dead, cause of death, if there were infertile people, if there were, if they had miscarriages, whether there were any unusual talents, when these talents first arose. So these family histories, they had several thousands of these that they solicited by getting people they knew who were eminent or prominent. They asked members of their family to fill out, their extended family to fill out these forms and send them to Cold Spring Harbor, to the Eugenics Record Office. These were kept there until the Eugenics Record Office was closed around 1938 or 39. And the papers were sent to the University of Minnesota, the collection of all of these family histories, to the Dike Institute in the University of Minnesota. I'm not sure if they still have that. You can check that out. You may even find that your grandfather filled one out.
Interesting, but they would have been, they solicited specific families to fill them? Is that the only way that people would...
No, some people read about it and asked that they would like to fill it out. They advertised in their own eugenics journal to get people to fill it out. They asked physicians that if they had any unusual hereditary conditions in families to fill this out, and asked that to take a pedigree of their patient and send it on, or have the patient send it on. So they used multiple approaches.
Both my grandfather, prior to going to the University of New York in Pennsylvania, had attended a small college in upstate New York. It was located in a hamlet in upstate New York. It was called Houghton College, and Houghton College was the Houghton family. They come from the founders of Corning Glass, and it was interesting because after I believe the second annual conference, or international conference on eugenics, which I believe was in 1912.
The first was 1911 or 1912.
Okay.
The second was held at that was held in London. The second was held at the American Museum of Natural History in 1921 or 22.
Okay.
And the third was held in 1932, also at the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
So what I discovered is doing some research on that college, is one of the family members, who was a medical doctor, who was a John Houghton, had spent around $100,000 researching their family history in 1912, around the same time as that first conference, and tracing their lineage back to William the Conqueror. My question is was there a rise in the importance? And my grandfather, his sister, they traced their family lineage back to the colonial times, and she said it was necessary for her application of the Daughters of the American Revolution to do so. So my question is whether genealogy and genealogical research became more pronounced or important during those times.
Yes, there was an increased interest in genealogy and family history because of the eugenics movement, and they sort of go hand in hand. But the primary interest in the Daughters of the American Revolution is the ancestral pride of having roots in America going back to participation in the American Revolutionary War. My mother-in-law was a member of the DAR, and she had what was called a Babcock connection. This guy, Andrew Babcock, and his brother came over from England around 1750, and they were blacksmiths, and they became anchor makers. And during the Revolutionary War, Andrew Babcock was asked to help make the links for the chain that was stretched across the Hudson River that prevented the British from going north up the Hudson or south toward New York. And Benedict Arnold tried to sabotage it, but his plans were revealed by capture of Major Andre, and he fled. But Andrew Babcock was one of the guys who made this change. So that was my mother-in-law's connection to the DAR. But each person who tries to become a DAR member has to follow that connection of genealogy going all the way back, and they check it out against their list of family histories to make sure that everybody is connected.
It seems to me that you had brought up earlier Harry Laughlin, and it seems like Harry Laughlin and Wycliffe Draper, in connection with the Pioneer Fund, seem to have a focus on that colonial stock as importance for determining traits.
Right. And this was certainly shared by not only Laughlin, but Davenport and virtually everyone in the American eugenic movement. There were exceptions. like Thomas Hunt Morgan, who had considerable reason for having family pride because his maternal great-grandfather was Francis Scott Key, and he had another relative who was governor of Maryland, and his uncle and his father were generals in the Confederacy as Morgan's Raiders. So he had lots of these patriotic connections, but he considered this all bunk. He had contempt for history, and the reason that he had this was that as a child, he said he was robbed of his childhood because all these Confederate veterans would swamp his father's and uncle's farm, and he didn't get the attention that he felt he should have had from his father because these veterans were gobbling up the time. So that was what soured Morgan on it. And he had a suspicion that eugenics hadn't proven its case, that until you had the genetic evidence that these behavioral traits were inherited, you were investing a lot of time and a lot of possible mischief in assigning these traits without sufficient evidence. So he was a skeptic.
In the early 1900s, there seemed to be better baby contests. There seemed to be meet-up groups or state fairs. My question
Those
is...
were Laughlin's favorites, but the winners of these better baby contests and the like, these eugenic fitness awards where they would give medals, were usually people that you would call established, reasonably, I wouldn't call them wealthy, but reasonably well off in their lives as middle-class professionals or farmers who were relatively prosperous, whose children did well in school. But these were not people that you wrote biographies about. They were not famous people, whereas Galton would have scoffed at this effort of fitter family contests that were carried out in the United States, because he felt that, and of course he's British, he was part of the elite. He came from the Darwin, Wedgwood type elite. So Galton's view of what constituted accomplishment was totally different than just middle-class achievement.
So how did the eugenics on a philosophical level play out in ordinary life? In other words, if the attempt was being made to, to splice or graft certain desirable characteristics, how was this accomplished?
Well, it wasn't. That's why the articles in these eugenics journals lament, and in the three congresses, they lament the small birth rate of the very talented, because the ones who are at the top of the intelligence scores and the ones who have biographies written about them are the ones that have 2 children or 1 children, whereas laboring people are having 5 children or 7 children. So the argument that was being made in these eugenics debates was that we were committing race suicide, or we were creating a future where mediocrity or less will prevail, and the number of talented individuals will diminish to the detriment of civilization. That was a constant theme where the argument was you've got to have more kids, you've got to have more kids. But a lot of the wealthier people were saying we don't want more kids, we want to have just 2 kids or 3 kids, and we don't have the money, and we won't have the time to devote to our careers.
See, that's the part where you talk about the positive side of eugenics. When I look at both of my grandparents, who were both scientists, both, physicists, and my grandmother was studying to be a doctor in medicine at the time, and I look at the outcome, 8 children of their own. One of my aunt has 8 children himself. They both have PhDs as well. My question is, does it look like, from an outsider's point of view, that it may have been an attempt on their side of things to implement some of the positive eugenics that they saw, and was it potentially viewed as almost a moral obligation or something that you do for the betterment of mankind?
Well, they could have absorbed that as a justification for having a larger family. Larger families were not uncommon between the 1880s and around 1910 to 1915, and then they began to get much smaller, and they got smaller for a number of reasons. Number one was the tremendous drop in infant mortality, because until the 1920s, 20%, 30%, even 50% infant mortality was not unusual in most parts of the world. But when you dropped infant mortality because of the germ theory, which developed in the 1880s on, and because of public health measures, which began chlorinating water, pasteurizing milk, passing Food and Drug Administration supervision of our foods. Once this began, effective sewage system, cleaning up the filth of cities, when all of these procedures were introduced in those years, if you had 7, 8, 9 kids, and suddenly they're all living into their teens and adulthood, then you've got heavy-duty expenses and very heavy-duty time commitments, and most people weren't willing to do that. So the birth control movement arose as a consequence of the germ theory, which caused a drop of infant mortality, and therefore people were saying, I don't need 8 kids there, 2 or 3 survived to maturity.
Yeah, that was an interesting. When I read about the Planned Parenthood origins, the Houghton family that I was researching co-founded that with Margaret Sanger. But my question, the other question, I was reading a book called The Chosen by Jerome Carabel, which talks about the enrollment guidelines at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton in the early 1900s, and the attempt to control the population by focusing less on meritocracy and more on intangibles like character, so that the admissions could control who came into the university. And I guess my question is, was it possible that eugenics influenced large universities so that they used their admissions standards to control the population, thus controlling the output of the family lines, desirable families breeding with other desirable families?
If so, it would have had a minimal effect, because until World War II, the number of people who got bachelor's degrees was minuscule, because there were very few scholarships and virtually no free higher education. I was lucky. I got a scholarship to NYU. At the time, there were only, I think, 3 scholarships at NYU and 2 scholarships at Columbia. This was in 1949. That's it, for the entire city of 5 or 6 million people. And that meant if you wanted to go to college, you either went to a free one. In those days it was city college. And that was based on a meritocracy. You had to take a competitive exam, and only those who got in the top layer of it, the exam, got into Brooklyn College or a city university. So ironically, the city university was the one that was practicing eugenics. Although they didn't call it that.
Right. That kind of dovetails into the other question, which is was applied eugenics or eugenics theoretical eugenics? Was it a class-driven thing? Was it more stratified? Was more people who were on the higher echelons interested than the everyday person?
Well, there are several ways I can respond to that. There was a guy by the name of Schneider who wrote a history of eugenics in France. And he showed that in France, eugenics was a big umbrella under which you had monarchists, you had communists, you had fascists, you had Malthusians, you had anti-Malthusians. So you've got all these different groups about how people should breed and which people should breed, based on ideas that are democratic, based on ideas that are authoritarian, based on Lamarckism, based on Weissmannian germplasm of a fixed pessimistic nature or fortunate nature. So you got everything. So there was no consistent way in which eugenics could be defined as monolithic in the eugenic movement. And even at these eugenic conferences, the international ones, three that you mentioned, those three had papers from all these different groups. If you look at the table of contents, you'll see that people came from different countries with different points of view of what constitutes it.
So the application of the interest was there from myriad groups, and its application was probably as diverse as the amount of groups who were interested in it.
Yes, I would say there were. It doesn't mean that if there were 20 different movements that they all had equal proportion or equal influence, because some of them were nut groups like these fascist groups, and people sort of shied away from those. But the major ones that gained most of the support and wrote most of the articles and had most of the people who called themselves eugenicists active in the program were those following the American school, which was the Cold Spring Harbor eugenic record office approach of restrictive immigration, marriage laws, compulsory sterilization, and encouragement of the talented to have larger size families. There's nothing compulsory about positive eugenics in their view. And then you had, as the second group, the one that Muller and Huxley favored, were eugenics is another way of using the principles of evolution to allow humans to progress to a higher level, where more people are intelligent, where intelligence and talents increase not only in quantity but in the quality of their achievements, that you keep selecting for health, longevity, intelligence, talent, compassion, leadership, other types of virtues that you assume have a hereditary component to them. And that's the nut. Do they have a hereditary component to them? That evidence is still lacking.
So aside from, the work by the Nazis in World War II and beyond, what known experimentations or what efforts have there been to prove the work of that latter group that you just mentioned?
Well, eugenics went into a total collapse, except for the group that you mentioned, the pioneer group that had a small amount of money to support race and IQ and other things that are taboo in scientific circles. You have to go to the Pioneer Fund to get support to do such a study. But other than that, eugenics went into a decline. Hitler killed it.
Did it go into a decline or did it go to a less visible? I mean, there still seems to be some fingerprints of the eugenics movement in modern day applications. You know, do you think it went underground or do you think it went away?
As a vehicle driven by publications or meetings or interest in academic circles, it's disappeared. As a belief that there is a hereditary basis for people's bad behavior and a hereditary basis for people's good behavior and a hereditary basis for talents, there is a widespread, if almost universal belief that this is approximately true. But if you use the word eugenics, you kill it.
It's interesting.
So eugenics to be discussed with other vocabulary because it's a poisoned word.
Have you heard of a organization called the American Scientific Association?
No.
They are a religious organization that's a parachurch organization that existed, I believe, starting in the 50s through the 60s, 70s, and even to present. The school that my grandfather and my father went to in Houghton in New York, where they studied physics, this organization was still having conferences mid-60s and beyond where they were having eugenics as a central topic at the conferences and inviting groups from Oxford and Leeds to come and speak on eugenics still in the mid-60s.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't run across it. Do you know who the founders are?
I'll find that and I'll email it to you.
Yeah, I'll be interested because that one, I cast a pretty big net when I was working on the thing, and I don't recall encountering that.
Yeah, I think my theory, my mom had always asked some questions about modern applications of eugenics, and when I saw for example, she had applied to go to school in Houghton in '67 and they didn't have any openings. They wouldn't, so she was on a waiting list to get to school, and she had not a road, it wasn't a Rhodes Scholar, it was some kind of scholarship they gave out in New York in the '60s where they only had one scholarship, and she had won a full ride, and that was the college she chose, but they had very strict admissions standards. And that's where I had that question about the admission standards being a way to control the entrance, because I know that for that family it was very important.
Yeah, there's. I've heard of one college that has something like that. It's called Deep Springs College, and it's out in Death Valley, California. And it was set up by the founder of the American Telluride Company. And he made his money on these ores that he processed, rare earths and stuff like that. And he believed in a sort of rugged individualist type of activity. So the students they recruit, when they come there, they have to do the cooking, they have to do the cleaning. Everybody learns how to work in Death Valley and not die.
Right.
And it's an undergraduate program, and all of their students end up in graduate schools or professional schools because they have all of these human capacities of a work ethic and very intense learning in the liberal arts.
The other question I was going to ask you is, so you talked about the positive side of eugenics. On the negative side, so one of the first eugenics conferences, the one in 1912, I believe that President Roosevelt was an advisor to. Is that correct?
Right.
And that's where they had come
So
up.
was Churchill.
Right. It
Right.
it seems like two things. It seems like a lot of the funding for these things came from. It seems like the Rockefeller Foundation was one of the primary funders of eugenics.
And Carnegie.
And Carnegie.
Carnegie money. Yeah.
What was their interest in eugenics? Why would they fund it?
It was until the 1930s. It was widely believed by successful people that they had good genes. That it wasn't just a good education or a lot of money and opportunities handed to them, but that they came from a decent stock that they took a pride in and felt that this should be cultivated, that a small number of people are leaders in any generation, and as you get more of these people, it benefits civilization. That was Galton's dream. That was Muller's dream. That was the hope of positive eugenics.
And I guess in that 1912 conference, they listed a number of, on the more negative eugenic side of things, that seem to have been adopted by the Nazis in World War II and leading up to World War II.
Right, because Plutz, starting around 1895, began preaching racial hygiene, and in 1905 he gave it a formal name, race hygiene. But the roots of it he began developing before that each country had an obligation to cull its stock of its more degenerate elements and keep them from breeding. And that was the negative eugenics movement that he had absorbed, applied to race. And of course that was a disaster when race hygiene was taken over by the Nazis.
And that's the part.
They didn't invent it.
Right.
They took it from Plutz.
Right. They took. My question is like within the last year, I've seen events come up in India where there had been forced sterilizations going on in India. I've seen claims of vaccines that have been that include birth control measures. There's a lot of claims out there, but some of them are just pretty, prima facie obvious that they're happening. Is that still modern versions of eugenics? Is the seed still based in that movement, or is it something else?
I think it's based less on eugenics than on population control, and the belief that people shouldn't have more than 2 children, particularly if they can't support them. So they don't think of it necessarily as a eugenic measure, but as an economic one. And that was certainly true in China with the one-child family. It had nothing to do with eugenics in a direct way. But when I was in China with a bunch of people in human genetics meeting our counterparts, we raised a lot of these questions about the eugenic and genetic consequences of having a one-child family. And I learned that they had thought about it, Chinese physicians, and they said that if you have a child with a birth defect, you're allowed to have another child, but if there's prenatal diagnosis available, you'll have to use prenatal diagnosis to have another child.
But I think that's all the questions that I had for you.
Okay, feel free to contact me again.
Yeah.
I'd like to know your progress. That'd be neat.
Yeah, and I'll see if I can track down that stuff on the American Scientific Association and send it your way.
Right. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks so much. Bye-bye.